Hi, Kevin. Welcome to our virtual newsroom. It's such a great opportunity to have you here. And today we're going to be inviting you to chat a little bit about U.S. politics and also U.S.-China relations. But before we go into all that, I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit about yourself. So, you know, what you do, what's your current project? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for inviting me to be on your program. Happy to have a chance to share my thoughts about what's going on with your fans and everything. 我先说一句中文吧，然后我们再换英文呢。其实听众，我跟你们说一句，上周我试图跟 Lizzi 录一下这个节目嘛，不过我发现这半年时间我在美国做一些就是跟中国完全没有关系的工作之后，我中文真的退步了不少，所以这种日常的交流我们还可以做呢。不过论到那些稍微 nuance 一点的话题，我真的发现用中文不行，所以接下来这个节目我们会用英文来录哈，然后后来配一些字幕。所以 yeah, thanks for your patience. I got back to the U.S. in June of last year. And since then, yeah, chances to use Chinese have been kind of few and far between. So right now I work actually at a company that's doing COVID testing. And so that's a pretty local job. 跟中文完全没有什么关系啊，所以一天到晚都是用英文交流，跟客户跟那个同事啊什么的。But yeah, I've always kind of worked in that industry, in the life sciences industry. And that ended up taking me, well, actually, so in 2017, I decided to move to China to learn Chinese. It had been like a promise to myself that I would learn to speak Mandarin before I turned 30. And so I was 29 at the time that I moved to Beijing and enrolled in classes there. I spent about 6 months in classes and then left school, even though I had planned to stay in class for a year. I got kind of tired of not working, and then went to work for an American company in China. So at that time, I was, basically acting as like a bridge between our office in the U.S. and then customers in China. So finding distributors and helping to sell our product there. Yeah, so that lasted for about 4 years that I was living in China, and then decided to come home in the middle of last year.
Yeah. So during your time in China, can you just, looking back on that experience, what are some of the highlights of your China experience? What are some of the things that you can vividly remember to this day?
Oh boy, there's probably a lot. I don't know how much time you have, but probably not enough to hear everything. It was kind of an eye-opening experience for me because I had only been to China once or twice before for business trips before deciding to move there. So I think the first time I went was probably in the middle of 2016, just to go to some conferences and customer presentations and things like that, and then deciding to move there. So, I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is that, the China of my imagination was just like very, very different than what it ended up being. And also like learning to speak Chinese and kind of just viewing it through not so much of a foreigner's perspective. Like, granted, I'm always going to be a foreigner in China, no matter how good my Chinese is. But getting to understand it a little bit more from a local's perspective was kind of eye-opening for me. And, I can give you like one example of a pretty early memory that maybe shaped a little bit how I probably view China today. At least I can still remember that particular instance of reading an article. This is maybe 3 or 4 months into being into my Chinese study classes in Beijing. I remember reading an article on Baidu Xinmen, and it was about like a shooting incident in California where somebody had gone and shot 3 or 4 people, killed them, and then was killed by the police. And the comments below the article were basically some flavor of, it's a shame he didn't kill more Americans. Mm. And I remember going to my teacher and just saying like, what is this about? Like, why do you have people saying this? And he was just like, you could tell he was really embarrassed to see that, that's kind of like the first news article that I had read. That was my first taste of like reading online news in China, but that was like a first time that I kind of felt the sort of nationalism, for example, that we've seen, grow to today. And now it's become, kind of like maybe a little bit better understood. Just, US and China maybe aren't like, I don't know. I don't want to say just because of that one instance that it illustrates everything, but, maybe it just led me to start questioning the notion of US and China need to cooperate on everything and that we're friends. Because the longer I spent there, the more I got the notion that China as a country was a little bit hostile to the idea of US as a country leading the world kind of thing. I don't know why I thought of that as like something that, it wasn't a big thing, but it certainly like shaped my perception of things going forward.
Yeah, I see. So we're going to be talking about US and China relationships later on in this interview. But before we turn to that topic, I wanted to talk about what's happening in the United States right now. Now we have people who don't agree on everything, which is predictable and that's just normal. But we also don't agree on basic facts.
Yeah.
And we don't even share a common vocabulary anymore. I mean, we use the same words like facts, truth, patriotism, but they just don't mean the same thing anymore. I mean, so for someone who, been living in the United States for quite some time in your life, and for someone who actively observed the last 4 years of Trump presidency, I wanted to invite you to look back at the past 4 years. So, I wanted to leave aside Trump as a person, Trump's personality first. Let's just talk about his policies and his legacies. So, what are some of his greatest achievements and what are some of his biggest mistakes to the United States? Sure.
I mean, very possibly in terms of recent history, you've seen more of America than I have, right? So I moved to China kind of at the very beginning of Trump's presidency. It was February of 2017, so he had been in office for 1 month. And then I came back, towards the end of his presidency. So, I think from that perspective, it was actually like a little bit beneficial to my mental health to not be in the country all the time because, I can tell you, like, I remember back in November of 2016, I don't remember the date of election day that year, but I remember when he won, like I went on Facebook and I just posted the word fuck like 20 times in a row because I was just like appalled by the idea that he had won. There are like a lot of things that he did for the country that were not good. I would say the first and foremost is just potentially what he's done for the brand of America, in the sense that this is supposed to be a country that is welcoming to people of all shapes and colors and sizes and backgrounds and religions and whatever. And I think, more than a few times during his presidency, he made it pretty clear that he had like a sort of preference for like a white sort of Northern European immigrant as opposed to somebody coming over the southern border or somebody coming from an African country or something like that. And so, when you look at like a lot of the top companies in the US, you look at Google and you look at who's leading Microsoft and so on, a lot of these companies are either founded by or run by immigrants to the US. And like, anything that we do as a country today that is going to affect people in 10 or 15 years from now in their decisions of like, do I go live in the United States or do I go live in Canada or do I go live in Singapore or do I go live in China, for example, I think is not good for American competitiveness. So, that's something that I was disappointed by like in the beginning, and, maybe to an extent my disappointment in that just subsided a bit because it was a bit of an uncontrollable factor. And kind of at the same time, like as I spent more time in China, I at least personally came to accept a good portion of the narrative that, the future conflict for the US in the 21st century is not between Russia and the US. It's not between the EU and the US. It's between China and the US. That's going to be kind of the main power struggle of the 21st century. And so as I came to sort of accept that lens, that view of the world, a lot of things that the Trump administration did from the perspective of China policy seemed to make sense to me. Like I said, I kind of had the benefit of not having to live and breathe what was on CNN and, on the front page of the New York Times every day because I wasn't here and wasn't paying all that much attention to it from a day-to-day perspective. like I remember also early on, 2016, 2017, right after he'd won the election and right after he had come into office, like he would tweet something just like crazy, incredibly stupid, crazy tweet, and then that would be at the top of the news cycle for the next 24 hours. And you'd have instances of reporters asking Republican congressmen, Republican senators, like, well, what do you think of Donald Trump's tweet kind of thing? And they would always say something like, I don't read all of the president's tweets. And I remember thinking back then, again, like this is somebody myself used to be like very staunchly Democrat, had always voted blue like my entire life. And I'd see their answer, and I just think that, oh, that's just like dodging the question. They're cowards. They don't want to say what they actually think about this crazy, crazy president that we have. But I guess like after 4 years of that, I found myself more and more thinking the same thing. Like, I'm just not going to listen to every single tweet that he says, because he says like absolutely crazy things every day. And he'll go do like 2 rallies in a day where he's speaking for 6 hours. And like, if you're speaking off script for 6 hours, like you're going to end up saying some pretty crazy things. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I just I got a little tired of, let's say, like the left-leaning sort of corporate media making their sole purpose, like picking everything that Donald Trump says and like finding a way into making that the crisis of the day. It's just very tiring. And, like as time went on, you can argue about like whether or not we should have put higher tariffs or lower tariffs, or if it should have been tariffs plus other policies. But generally speaking, like at least getting America to a place where we can stomach the idea of like having a trade war with our biggest adversary, and getting some of our allies like the UK, Australia, Canada on board with that. I think that's overall a good thing. So to an extent, like I guess I'm willing to look past a lot of the other like very, very, very flawed aspects of his person, and being somewhat thankful that, his presidency was only 4 years, but I think at least in terms of China policy, it'll have a lasting effect.
Interesting. So, there was one thing that caught my attention. You actually, so you are not, say, a registered Republican who voted Republican your entire life. You were actually, coming from the other end of the spectrum. You were very liberal growing up. So, and, we know your decision in the 2020 election, but, looking around, would you describe yourself or your decision as an outlier in your community, or do you see sort of more people voting in the same pattern in the community that you have around you?
So in my community, yeah, definitely an outlier. Definitely an outlier. So like I went to kind of a fancy private school in LA. And so LA, like to begin with, is already a very liberal city. And then sort of the fancy private schools in LA are like ultra liberal kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, like as far as my friend group from high school, like if I think of, maybe 15 of us, I think there's 2 of us that would have voted red in the past election, and then everybody else like blue for life kind of thing. So that's been interesting, coming back, because like before I went to China, like I was very much in line with everybody else in terms of like how we voted and how we thought about these sort of like political issues sort of thing. And I came back from China just like a very different person on that sense. And again, I think it was probably just the initial angle of like, oh, what the Trump administration is saying about China and how they are like the greatest threat to the American way of life, for example, I found a lot of truth in that. And from that, maybe like it was kind of peeling back the curtain into certain other, political tenets, I guess, that I'd always held as unshakable until, maybe a year or 2 ago.
So do you think the Biden administration is going to stick to the same kind of Trump's, China strategy, or do you think something's going to be different this time around?
I don't, like that's not really for me to predict. I was pretty worried, I suppose, before, let's say, I don't know, even as much as a couple of weeks ago or as little as a couple of weeks ago, I think I was maybe a little bit more worried than I was now. Because coming up to the election, let's say the last year and a half, Biden's been getting a little bit tougher on China. I think there was sort of a turning point where he just came out and said Xi Jinping is a thug. There's a guy who's a thug and something like that. But everything up until then had been much more about, I remember a specific quote from him. I think it was like February of 2019 or something, where he's saying like, they're not bad folks, when he's talking about China. And like, that's absolutely true. I mean, again, the issue of separating Chinese people who live in China, Chinese people who have immigrated to America, as a completely separate issue from the policy that's being set by the top, 20 people in the country. Like, those are very, very different things. But he also in that speech said something to the effect of, the notion that China is going to eat our lunch, 中国会不会抢我们的铁饭碗什么的. It's like, he thought of that as something that was just like ridiculous, that there's no chance that would ever happen. But I think that's pretty naive in terms of how much of American manufacturing, for example, has already moved overseas. And, the fact that in the last 10 years, Huawei went from being a company that basically nobody in the Western world had ever thought of to, sort of like the first and foremost. I mean, I would say Huawei is further along than Western telecommunications companies in developing 5G technology and so on. So I just think that's pretty naive to say that there's no chance that China's ever going to outcompete America. I think it's really naive. And so things like that, I think, were a little worrying to me. And then to see just sort of the Democrat Party in general being kind of hyper-focused on the one and only threat as Russia. It's like from 2016, why did we lose the election? It's not because we had a terrible candidate. It's because Russia. That was the whole narrative from 2016, because I think, Hillary Clinton's loss was kind of earth-shattering for a lot of people. And so it's much easier to say that it's this outside boogeyman, as opposed to looking at yourself in the mirror and realizing we picked the wrong candidate. And then also, I think more recently, Biden also said something to the extent of, China is our biggest competitor, but Russia is our biggest threat. And again, I think that's just a big misrepresentation of fact and of what is going to play itself out over the next 2 to 3 decades. So I would say in those senses, I was pretty worried running up to the election. I was pretty worried after the election, after it was clear that he won. And then as he started picking his cabinet, like Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, a lot of these people that he's picked and the people that are working under them are essentially Obama administration, Obama Biden era picks. And, it's hard to argue that the Obama Biden administration from 2008 to 2016 did a great job with respect to China. I mean, in terms of if you look at when the PLA, et cetera, was filling out their presence in the South China Sea, most of that took place in Obama Biden years. So I mean, I've been pretty worried running up to the election, after the election, but recently, I've seen kind of the rhetoric turn more towards, for example, echoing what Pompeo said 5 or 6 days ago, that what's happening in Xinjiang, for example, is a genocide. And Pompeo, I don't know if it was his decision, but declaring that they're going to ban all cotton and tomato imports from Xinjiang. And so far, I haven't seen an immediate rush to overturn that particular policy. When Biden got into office, I think in his first couple of days, he's written 17 executive orders to overturn a lot of the things that Trump did, but that was notably absent. So, I suppose cautiously optimistic is the best way to describe it. I don't know, politicians in general, whether they're Republican or Democrat, I think they're all pretty awful. I think they're all pretty awful and very much looking after their self-interest before they're looking after the interests of their country and the people who live there. But, at this point, perhaps there's been enough of a change in the US towards general attitude towards China, for example, that it wouldn't be politically beneficial to go back into the mode of cooperation and engagement at all costs.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you look at sort of the Senate confirmation hearings, they all describe China as their sort of number one enemy, or at least number one rival to deal with in the next century. So, honestly, I think I'm a little more optimistic about the Biden administration, at least some of the top people in the administration, to be more clear-eyed about what China truly is and to deal with China. Although, I guess it's still too early to make those predictions. We're gonna, see what they actually do. But so as you just said, I think the more I talk with liberals, the more conservative I become, and the more I talk with conservatives, the more liberal I become. It's just I'm just sort of, in between. But like, I feel like I can see sort of fallacies and weaknesses on both sides. And sometimes I'm really torn, but
right.
yeah.
There's a show, I don't know if you've ever heard of a journalist named Matt Taibbi for Rolling Stone, and he has a show called Useful Idiots. And so at the beginning of every show, they have a segment called Republicans Suck, Democrats Suck. And it's just like they come up with examples every week of just like the absolute ridiculous and terrible things that both parties do. And yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a good sign. I don't think it's necessarily a sign of being, because you're a foreigner or whatever. But like you're only given two choices. You're only given menu A or menu B. And like on menu A, there's like you're anti-abortion and pro-gun and in favor of lowering taxes and you want to build a border wall and you want to decrease immigration. And then on the other side, it's like there's the exact opposite. And so like why does necessarily, for example, if you have a religious upbringing and you think that abortion is a bad thing and you do not want abortion to be legal, like why does that one thing then decide for you how you feel about guns and marijuana and gay marriage and, the whole list of things, right? So I think, you pointing out that the more you talk to one side, the more of the other that you become, I think is like to an extent a sign of political maturity rather than just saying, okay, well, I belong to menu A and I'm going to take everything off it. So,
but like, the world is still, divided into camps.
Yeah.
For the sample of people who voted for Trump, you seem very different. And there's, you're different in many different ways, but there's one key difference I happen to know is that you actually accept the legitimacy and the result of the election. For someone who voted for Trump and accept the results of the election, what do you have to say to those people, especially some pro-democracy, Chinese-speaking activists? They are some of the most vocal Trump supporters, which in and of itself is not there's nothing wrong with it. But it seems like they're also very, very susceptible to some of Trump's lies, braggeries, theatrics, and those kind of things. And this became so obvious in the aftermath of the election. So what do you have to say to those people? And how would you convince them, if you can, that the election was actually fair, but the majority of the Americans chose the other side?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, how do I start that? So to say that of people who voted for Trump, the majority of them don't accept the result of the election, I don't think that's necessarily true. His rhetoric, everything he says is just like a tool for overblowing things. And so, when he says the election was stolen, for example, I mean, it wasn't stolen. It wasn't stolen. Like the Republican Party got out hustled, right? So months ago, I think back in March of last year, there were decisions being made about the use of mail-in ballots. And like mail-in ballots, frankly, are not good for the Republican Party, or at least based on the demographics of this year, they were not good for the Republican Party. In the way, like, for example, there's something that's called ballot harvesting, which gets thrown around like it's some kind of nefarious, like very illegal thing. And it's not illegal. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily great for democracy where you have somebody going in a neighborhood and helping a bunch of people fill out their ballots and then delivering those ballots for them. I mean, it kind of gets in the way of the idea of one vote, one person, but it's not illegal, right? And so those were laws that were democratically decided, and whether you like them or not, it's the law. And just because something doesn't feel right or feels kind of shady doesn't mean that it's illegal or it constitutes fraud or stealing the election. Like, I don't know how many cases there were, how many lawsuits there were alleging election fraud, but apparently every time Trump's lawyers got in front of a judge and had the opportunity to actually press a case for election fraud, they would abandon it and say like, oh, no. We're not here to talk about widespread election fraud. We're here to talk about, mail-in ballots or something like that. So yeah, I mean, there just isn't the evidence for it, for widespread anyway. There's always going to be evidence for election fraud because in a country of 350 million people with, this year, 150 plus million voters, everything that could possibly happen is going to happen. But, it's the difference between saying like, shit happens versus taking one example and then pretending that is representative of something that happened on a much bigger scale. So I don't know. I mean, I would say that like for people who supported Trump in 2020, like, don't do what the Democrats did in 2016, which is spend the next 4 years complaining that the only reason we lost is because Russia hacked our election. Like, there's still, I think, people who believe that, you know, Russia like literally hacked into voting machines in 2016. And that's the reason that we, you know, that I say we, because back then, you know, I was a Hillary supporter. We lost in 2016. And it's, you know, like, don't deny reality. It's not going to do any good. Yeah, I think the point about Chinese dissidents and human rights supporters and democracy supporters, kind of, I don't know, do you think it's fair to say as a whole that they favor Trump more than they favor Biden in this election?
So that's a great question. So there's no statistics on that. There's no comprehensive evidence. But if you look at the most vocal ones, or the ones who are most active on Twitter, it does seem to be the case that there's a extremely obvious skewing to the right. And I would say, you know, if I have to put a number on it, I would say it's 9-1. So, you know,
1.
Yeah, 9-1. So, you know, 90% supporting Trump, 10% supporting other side. Yeah, but, you know, that's just my educated guess. It's not a, you know, hard proof. Yeah.
Okay, so if we assume that there is like a pretty overwhelming support for Trump, like among, you know, Chinese dissidents, let's say, in the U.S., you know, like I'm not necessarily as bearish about them buying into things that might be called conspiracy theories, because for one, you know, I don't know, just participating in the democratic process is a good thing. And, you know, caring so much about it that you get super worked up and get in fights with people is maybe caring a little bit too much, but I think it's better than the opposite. I think there's a lot of people like in the US who take the ability to vote for a politician or vote a politician out of office. I think there's too many people that take that for granted and don't, you know, like, so on that metric anyway, or on that side, you know, like, I'm happy to see how passionate people get about it. On the other hand, yeah, it's not going to do anybody any good to deny reality for the next 4 years. It's not going to help, like, let's say, the Republican policies that they support, which would generally be like lower taxes and, you know, tougher on illegal immigration and things like that, which, look, I mean, I can understand if you came to the US through a process of applying and going through a year and a half of this, that, and the other, like, why would you want people to be able to come here without having to go through everything that you did? Like, I can very much understand that. And then, you know, it appears, at least at this day in America, like, the Democratic Party is definitely not socialist. The Democratic Party, as far as, you know, the global environment of politics goes, is pretty right-leaning. But for the American context, you know, like, one party is going to be accused of something, the Democrats will be accused of socialism, and the Republicans will be accused of fascism or something like that. You only have two picks, you know. And I think that so with that label and some of the things that lead to that label, for example, like, you know, oh, we're just going to up the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Like, yeah, it sounds great, but also there's a lot of businesses who probably can't afford to pay their workers $15 an hour. And if they can't pay their workers, then they're going to go out of business. And if they go out of business, and that's less jobs for both, like, the person who lost the business and for the people who would have been working there for $12 an hour instead. And so I think that people who come from, you know, let's say like China specifically, but then also people who have come to the US from Venezuela, or people who have come to the US from Cuba, you know, like, they tend to be right-leaning, right? And it's not because they're racist, and it's not because they support white supremacy or like whatever crazy theory you want to throw out there. It's just because they recognize, I think, certain aspects of things that they wanted to run away from in their home country, in, let's say, like, the Democratic Party. But yeah, like, getting back to the question of what would I say to them? I'm not here to lecture. Like, I'm not here to lecture and say that you're dumb for not accepting reality. I mean, for one, you know, like, maybe spend less time on Twitter and talk to more people in real life, as opposed to talking to your, you know, opponents on Twitter, because every conversation online doesn't matter. It just turns into, like, you know, a massive amount of shit talking for no reason. I have a rule that I try to follow, which is I don't usually start fights with people unless it's somebody who's like a million times more powerful than I am, right? So if I'm going to tweet something at somebody, like, I'll tweet something at Hillary Clinton, you know, because no matter what I say, she's, like, still could crush me and have exactly what you want to do. But yeah, like, I'm not going to go looking for fights with people and just, like, pull somebody's tweet and say, like, oh, you're an idiot, unless, like, I guess punching up, like, I don't ever want to punch down. And then, yeah, for the most part, like, I don't want to start fights on Twitter. Like, if somebody attacks me, like, I'll attack back a little bit, but really, like, I found, you asked me, how do I fit in with my friends, like, most of my friends are very, very diehard liberal in LA. Most of the friends that I went to high school with, grew up with. We get in arguments online sometimes, and then we go have dinner together. And it's just like a very different feeling, with very little exception. The people that, like, I would fight with online, when we're sitting around a table together having a conversation, we're a lot more reasonable. And so, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's a little bit sad about this, right? Because one of the unifying characteristics, whether it's, people who have left China under circumstances where they fear for their safety, for the safety of their lives, or for their families, kind of thing, that have come to the US, I think that in terms of how America should stand up to the encroaching threat of, the Communist Party on American business, on freedom of speech, on companies expressing themselves and standing up for rights that they would stand up for in America, kind of thing, I think they'd be very much in agreement on that. And then when it comes down to, like, a sort of, I don't know, I would just want that to be kind of like the first level that binds people together, as opposed to, just getting in fights about how Biden stole the election, Trump is a Nazi, and so on and so forth. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard, right? Because this isn't something that just exists in, like, the Chinese language community. It very much exists in, like, the white American English language community as well. I mean, there's for example, the desire to use the word, like, coup or insurrection to describe what happened on January 6th. Like, within a day of it happening, within hours of it happening, like, most of the media outlets in the US were very quick to describe it as a coup or an insurrection. And, like, if you talk about a coup, I mean, a coup is where you actually take over the levers of power, and you take over the military, you take over the intelligence agencies. Like, the guys who broke into the Capitol building, the men and women, I should say, that broke into the Capitol building, like, above all, they're just kind of stupid. The chance that they're going to take over the US government is like less than zero. It's just, like, absolutely less than zero. And so, like, I don't want to use language to describe that as a coup, because I think it just kind of inflames the, I don't know, kind of overstates the seriousness of it. No, but just, like, the fact that you have America very, very divided on, like, was this a coup, or was this just, like, a really stupid protest that got violent? And yeah, I mean, so I'm not necessarily optimistic to say that, people that are watching US politics unfold through a second language are going to be able to, like, parse exactly what's happening. And, when you take the information environments that people have, like, there's not as much Chinese language media, and there's probably nothing as authoritative as, like, Fox News or the New York Times in the US. And so you end up getting, kind of a screen capture with a translation that may or may not be correct about something that Joe Biden or Trump said, and before people even, like, sit down to talk to each other face to face, they're already thinking, like, well, the other side is crazy because they believe this and things like that. So I don't know. I mean, again, like, I wouldn't say that I have any wisdom to offer, or lecture anybody about what they should believe or what they shouldn't, other than if you sit down in a face-to-face conversation with somebody, you might not disagree with them as much as you think that you do, based on, like, how much you hate each other on Twitter.
Right. No, that's such an interesting perspective. But, since you mentioned the Capitol riot, so let's just, end on that happy note. So now Trump has officially become the first president in the US history who has been impeached twice. So how do you expect the second round of impeachment to pan out? I mean, now we hear from people like Mitch McConnell, who seemed more leaning toward, conviction. And we also hear from other established Republicans like, Lindsey Graham seems to be, less convinced that it's an impeachable crime. Mm-hmm. So any predictions on that? Any predictions on Trump's future endeavors? Or is he going to run again in 2024? Again, like, we don't know, but what will be your guess?
like whatever I guess, it's going to be wrong. But, yeah, I don't know. I don't think he will end up getting impeached. I don't think he'll end up getting impeached. I don't think there's enough support for it in the Senate. I mean, the Democrat majority is only a majority by one vote. So that means that there'd have to be a pretty significant number of Republican senators who voted to impeach. And I think at this point, Trump still has a lot of support in the US, if not from the politicians in the Senate, then at least from, a lot of just average voters, right? I mean, like 74 million votes. Is that how many it was? 74 million? That's a lot of votes, right? That's a lot of votes. It's 10 million more than he had last time. And so, there's very clearly a lot of support for him. And, I think as before, there's still a fear that if you turn on Trump as a senator, then your voter base is going to turn on you. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's not a great situation for the Republican Party. They're kind of in between a rock and a hard place. It's like, we either try to kill off this support for President Trump and then reclaim all of that support for our party so that we can put up a candidate in 2024 that's going to get all of the Republican vote, as opposed to having a situation where, half of the Republicans vote for Trump and half the Republicans vote for a third candidate or another candidate. And then, the other half of the country votes for the Democrat candidate and, they win with 538 electoral votes. But yeah, I don't know. My guess is that he probably won't get impeached. Or won't pass rather. But we'll see. Like, my guess is that I'm also probably going to be wrong on that because I tend to be.
I see. So yeah, so we'll see, as you just said. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for appearing on our show. And in the future, if there are interesting topics on U.S.-China relation, I'm sure there will be. We'll make sure to invite you back to share your insights. So Thank you so much for your time, Kevin. It was great talking to you.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to tune in. See you, Lizzie.
See you. Bye.